It's a truly beautiful sight to see all of these people, all of you coming onto the screen so quickly and us getting ready to start. So we'll get started in just a second. All right. Well, welcome to Culture Plus Bourbon, the March installment of the Norton Center's Culture Plus series. My name is Steve Hoffman, and I am the Executive Director of Center College's Norton Center for the Arts. Today, I'm in Danville, Kentucky, on the ancestral lands of the Cherokee, Shawnee, Shawnee, Yuchi, Adena, and Hopewell nations. We are thrilled you have chosen to spend the next hour or so with our curated panel of thought leaders and artists who will share their stories and ideas and art related to how we as Kentuckians value the bourbon industry. So thank you for joining us. Immediately following the discussion, we will launch our Culture Plus Encore program featuring some friends from Austin, Texas. Invoke is an incredible group of musicians who are inspired by bourbon. Enough so that they have written songs about bourbon and the bourbon industry. And so for the encore, they'll share a few great songs and stories as they relate to bourbon. There will be nothing more that you need to do except wait for a moment as we launch into the Zoom encore. The Culture Plus series is part of the Norton Center's Creative Conversations program, which is supported by an endowed gift by 1995 Center College graduate, Dr. Jeptha Johnson and Ken Michael. Now I'd like to introduce you to Molly Baker, the Norton Center's Engagement Services Manager. Molly.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Steve, and thanks to our panelists for being here today and for all of you for joining us. We're really excited about tonight's program. But before we get started, I'll just share a couple of logistical things with you. So first, just to let you know, you have a couple of viewing options. If you select speaker view, you'll find that the person who is speaking will be featured on your screen. But if you choose gallery view, you'll see multiple video feeds in a gallery type template. So all of tonight's speakers are co-hosts, so they'll be pinned to the top page. So if you would like to do it that way, you'll be able to see everyone who's speaking in that gallery view as well. I also want to let you know that we want to thank Joanna Huffman for being here. She's tonight's ASL interpreter. And if you find that her services will be useful, please be sure you select the gallery view option and pin her window so that she's featured on your screen. Next, you'll notice that you're muted, but you will have a chance to participate in a brief Q&A after the panel discussion takes place. So if you'd like to ask a question, please type it in the chat box and direct it to Matt Overing, who will collect those questions and field them to Lenny, tonight's moderator. We'll do our best to get to everyone's questions, but if we can't, we will try to follow up with you at a later time. But feel free to enter those questions in the chat whenever they come to you. So that being said, I'm going to throw it back to Steve, and just thanks again.
Great, thanks, Molly. It's amazing to see, and we know who some of you are. We know that you're from all over the country attending tonight's program, and that's really great. Welcome. I'd like to also thank the entire Norton Center staff for making this program happen and for all of the hard work our team is doing to get us prepared to have in-person programs again soon. Now, it is with great pleasure that I introduce Center College's president, Dr. Milton Moreland, for an official welcome. President Moreland, thank you so much for your ongoing support of cultural programs in our community and on our campus, especially now. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And I second your thanks to the Norton Center staff, an amazing group of people working here at Center College every day, serving our students and getting ready to serve this community with some amazing in-person performances coming up soon. So ready to rock the house again at the Norton Center. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome you from Center College in Central Kentucky. It's a beautiful part of the world. If you're not from here, we hope you'll come visit us. I am also excited to introduce our moderator tonight, Professor of Chemistry, Lenny de Moranville. Lenny's been at Center since 2012. I got to know Lenny well this year because he has been the director of our Olin Hall project, which just opened, an amazing new facility, redone and rebuilt facility for our science programs here at the college. So Lenny's an amazing professor, but also great with project management. Lenny, upon his arrival to campus for his interview, so the lore goes, at Center College, was asked what course he would like to teach. And he said, well, I'd like to teach the chemistry of beer and wine. And the interviewer said, oh, that won't work. And Lenny was a little disappointed and evidently dumbfounded. And he said, no, 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 you're going to have to teach the chemistry of beer and wine and bourbon. So thus began the class that Lenny teaches that incorporates the topic for tonight. I am pleased to turn the program over to Lenny to lead this amazing program with people in all aspects of the industry. So what a great theme. Thank you all, and look forward to joining you in hearing this great group of panelists. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, President Moreland, for that introduction, and thanks, Steve, and the rest of the Norton Center folks for this opportunity. I'm excited about tonight's panel. It's a fun group of individuals, all of them great storytellers, and so I'm going to go ahead and introduce them and then jump into some questions. So Freddie Johnson is the VIP visitor lead at Buffalo Trace Distillery, where he's a third-generation employee. Freddie's ability to connect with visitors has made him one of, if not the most sought-after tour guide in the industry. He's been recognized with all kinds of awards and is a member of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. Next on the panel, we've got Joyce Nethery, who's the master distiller at Jeptha Creed Distillery, which is co-owned and operated with her daughter. They focus on locally grown and sourced ingredients, including their really distinctive Bloody Butcher corn, which is grown on their family farm. Joyce trained as a chemist, so plus for her there, and chemical engineer, and worked as a process engineer and taught high school chemistry and physics before they opened the distillery. Pat Heist is right here in Danville. He's the co-founder of Wilderness Trail Distillery. He and his business partner, Shane Baker, co-founded Firm Solutions, which is a company that provides yeast fermentation products and technical services for distilleries, from small bourbon places to large fuel ethanol producers. And in just 6 years, Wilderness Trail's become the 14th largest bourbon producer in the US and the 18th member of the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. And Pat's been a great partner with the class that I teach. And in fact, we just literally like an hour ago submitted an article to talk about some bourbon to some other people. Mary Robin Spoonamore is a center graduate and the owner of Jane Barleycorn's Market and Bar that's in downtown Danville, just a few blocks from campus. That bar is frequently recognized as a top bourbon bar, and Jane Barleycorn says they strive to bring good things to the table, and I can attest that she does, not just with the food and the way she pairs it with bourbon and other beverages, but also the way that it fosters wonderful interactions. It's just a great atmosphere with unique experiences. And so that's actually where we're going to start tonight, is that Jane Barleycorn really brings that interaction between culture and bourbon to life. So we're going to start with a short video. And so Mary Robin, would you tell us about how this video we're going to watch, it's a post-Norton Center gathering, set the stage for that video.
Okay, sure. So I was so pleased that the video is part of the program to give you the example of probably the highlights of what happens in this space, Jane Barleycorn's. This doesn't always happen, but it's my good fortune that that Steve or Norton Center folks will bring their guests in. And so that happened as a usual night. And then bourbon, I think I would put it like this. Bourbon is, if I'm an architect of experiences, then bourbon is one of the major variables I get to play with. And so a curated collection is part of this experience. And sometimes when in time and space, when, you know, magic is set to happen, then, you know, usually it does when people are relaxed and just paying attention to what's in their glass and various complexities going on there. But also, you know, we were just chatting. And then sometimes things like this happen.
And so that was a gentleman by the name of Nathan Davis, who was an award-winning composer that was here for a program called The Other Mozart. His wife, Sylvia Milo, was the lead actress in that. And they were just hanging out afterwards, and he decided to compose a new piece of music on a bottle of bourbon, which is spectacular. And so Mary Robin, what does it mean to you that your place that you've built provides that type of space that nurtures those sorts of amazing interactions? Mary Robin, I think you're still muted.
I'm so sorry. So I just think that a lot of pleasure for me, of course, as being a host, but for how bourbon can bring people together, one, and then also this thing, bourbon and culture. When I thought about that this week, it just pairs so well. You know, it brings people together, and then you can layer on top of that, what else brings people together? Well, you think about the great bourbon pairings, bourbon and barbecue, bourbon and music, bourbon and chocolate pairing dinners or dessert courses. So I think in the glass that we pour often is this sense of, you know, community for people that appreciate bourbon, but also beyond that, if you don't like bourbon or you don't drink alcohol, there is a place. I mean, it's kind of says we're interested in letting go of our worries for a while and you know, being in the present space.
And so I want to sort of turn that to the rest of the panelists. You know, the series is called Culture Plus, and so for you in the places that you are, what's the intersection between bourbon and culture for you?
I guess I can go. You know, I think kind of like what Mary Robin was saying, you know, you got to kind of have a reason to get together before anything's going to happen, you know. And, you know, bourbon's a place that happens a lot of that time. And, you know, even just looking at the panel here, we have a very diverse group of people, even though this is a very small group. And, you know, looking at the different events that go on across the state of Kentucky relative to bourbon, you really see a lot of good culture and a lot of different people coming together for a common cause.
Well, I was just thinking about the bourbon and the importance to the culture is that the bourbon really kind of pulls together and represents a lot of the history. I mean, just the immediate thing within that bourbon is the year and the weather, and all of those factors come into play into making the bourbon and making the bourbon as awesome as it is. So when you get together and you get to taste the bourbon, you get to taste some of the history, because that bourbon in your glass is probably about at least 4 years old. So that's 4 years of winters, 4 years of springs, summers, you know, so all that history is kind of wrapped up in that bourbon glass.
Joyce, I'm going to flip on that. I'm going to tie you and Pat together. There is an unspoken rule about good bourbon and our culture. And the unspoken rule is you never bring out the good stuff with people you don't like. So if I don't like it, I'm not even going to tell you I've got some really good bourbon, because there's always a good story that goes with that bottle of bourbon. So if I don't like you, I won't even tell you I've got it, because I don't want to give you any of it. But the significance of it is, think about this. When you bring that bottle out, how many times have we been at that moment with friends and family? We start to pour. We start to share stories, just like you were talking about, all the years that it took for that bourbon to be what it is, the events that maybe happened in the course of our lives during that period of time. And the next thing you know, you look around, the bottle is about empty. Pat's got that look like, yeah, I've been there. The bottle is about empty. And all of a sudden somebody says, oh my word, look at the time. And all of a sudden we realize we've had such a wonderful time with those friends and family that time wasn't even a factor. And that to me is part of the culture of a good bourbon, and the state of mind when people come to Kentucky is they come to reminisce and be with friends and family, and time is not a moment that they worry about.
And so Freddie, for you, bourbon's a real family deal, right? Third generation employee at Buffalo Trace. Tell us a little bit about that aspect of things. What does it mean to you, and what has it meant to your family to have that sort of heritage and tradition?
Oh, well, Lenny, for me, I guess it's a little bit different because just like for Joyce, her family has, from an agricultural standpoint, they've been through the booms and the busts of corn and grains and things like that. And for me, I'm a third generation Buffalo Trace, and between my grandfather and my dad and we've got a chance to see the impacts of Prohibition, the Depression, the lull in the 60s to the beginning of the 2000s when bourbon was no big deal. And all of a sudden, if you've been with some old whiskey folks that have gone through those different generations with families, this period that we're in right now has never happened before, not to the degree that it's happening now with all family members and all different ethnic groups coming together to enjoy something. So for me, I got a chance to hear the times when my dad was talking about, there was nothing in the fridge, to the time when the Depression was going on, and to see what's happening today in our environment. It's very humbling. It's very humbling because these folks that are into bourbon, even like what Joyce had indicated a moment ago, what she was talking about with a good bourbon, 4 years old. Well, if you look back 4 years, bourbon was basically just starting to get into high gear. So we're in a period right now that for people that have made a lot of bourbon, like some of those that Mary's got on her shelf back there, made whiskey when there was no demand for it. They made it based on a vision. So that's kind of like the way I look at things now is there's a saying, old men shall dream dreams and young men shall see visions. And so what we're doing now is all this bourbon is being made today that Joyce and Pat and Lenny, you're creating a new generation of folks. These are the visionaries that are going to take bourbon and whiskey to the next level. So I'm excited about where I am, and I look back on my family, but I look at our group today, and I'm really excited about where bourbon and whiskey is going.
And so, Joyce, for you too, the distillery is a family heritage in the making, I guess, since you're relatively new. What's that aspect look like for you?
Well, for us, it's pretty awesome. We are a family-owned farm to distillery, and so every member of the family is involved in what we're doing. My daughter Autumn and I are running the distillery. My son just became an owner because there's these laws in our country that say anyone who's under 21 cannot be an owner of the distillery. But he turned 21 in April last year, and now he's an equal owner with his sister. So that's pretty awesome. And then my husband is involved in what we're doing because he grew up as a dairy farmer, and we had a dairy of our own for a while, so we're very much attached to the land. We still live on that same farm, and we still have the tractors and corn planters and all those pieces. So for us, it's the whole family is involved. We control all of the corn that we use. Is a beautiful red Bloody Butcher, and it is all estate grown. So we grow all of the corn ourselves on our own property. So it's all estate grown, and it's all grown within 10 miles of the distillery. So it's all super duper local. And being able to have my children there, growing up into adults and be able to watch them grow and mature. I mean, to me, in a lot of ways, I'm producing bourbon, and I'm attached to every barrel of bourbon that's out in our barrel barns. But mostly it's a special honor for me to be able to watch my children grow and mature as adults in the distillery.
That's a really fun aspect to it, that it's so integrated with family. And so you mentioned in there the estate grown corn, and you really talk about, or Jeptha Creed talks about this sort of farm to bottle idea. And so is there something driving that other than just your connection and your family's connection to the land? Or are there other goals that you're trying to achieve in that?
Well, for us, it's pretty literal. It's ground to glass. I mean, we own and manage and take care of the ground. There's a side product from distillation, the spent grains. We take those spent grains back to the farm, feed them back to our pigs and the cattle. And then cows and pigs have this thing where they produce poo, manure, and that manure re-nourishes the soil. So, we're taking care of the land, we're taking care of the soil. And then our corn is an heirloom corn. It's open pollinated, and that means that each kernel on the cob is a seed, and we can save the seeds over the winter, plant them back the following spring, and we get the same exact corn again. So it's very sustainable, it's very old-fashioned, and we put the seed in the ground, so we've got that ground part down, and then we control the process all the way through the distillation and into the glass. So that's where we get our ground to glass concept. I think one of the things that we're trying to really be about is about our local history, heritage, and culture, and that's obviously a lot of bourbon, but it's a lot of farming, and it's a lot of rural and agricultural too. So the sustainability and seed saving pieces of the corn is really truly a piece of who we are, what we want to be about, and how it's sustainable and life-giving throughout generations.
And Pat, you Wilderness Trail sort of has similar philosophy. I'm not sure you're growing your own corn, but am I remembering that right? That you guys are relatively local in ingredients as well?
Oh yeah, yep. I mean, from the get-go, we're very cognizant of the local economy, and we're a Kentucky proud organization. So everything that we can do within the state, we do. Most of our grain, our corn, even our rye, which most Kentucky distilleries use rye, but we're one of only a few that use Kentucky grown rye. So you were definitely very mindful of local grains and local farms and benefiting the local economy. Even though we're still a relatively small distillery, we grind about 1.25 million pounds of grain every week. So, the fact that we're getting most of that locally here is definitely a big plus for the economy. And as Joyce mentioned, the byproduct, the stillage, we give away as cattle feed, and we generate 100,000 gallons of that every day that we give away to local cattle farms. So besides making, what is going to be retail, nearly $1 billion worth of bourbon a year, all the grain that we're purchasing locally, as well as that stillage, those are big pluses for the economy.
And Mary Robin, Jane Barleycorns has a little bit of a local flavor to it too, right?
You're right. I think our menu at its best was chock full of ingredients from the local farmers, and that's when we're at our best. We always had the rotating menu, so it's a challenge to source it, weekly or as every 3 or 4 days. But certainly, I think that was when the restaurant aspect of this business was at its best, when we could buy locally and see that circle that Pat was mentioning. In fact, one of his corn growers comes in to Jane Barleycorns and regularly buys Wilderness Trail because it, of course, came from his farm. So it's just a nice circle that I appreciate too.
Hey, Leonard,
Yes.
just a quick one here. A lot of people are not familiar with the fact that they think about corn traditionally as being yellow corn for making bourbon. But Joyce has indicated her particular grains of corn are blood red, which is how it got the butcher. But then in Kentucky, as Pat can tell you, it's like a cornucopia. And what we've actually discovered is if you think about a cornucopia and all of the different colors of corn in that basket, there are places in Kentucky, there are distilleries in Kentucky that are making whiskey or bourbon with the blue corn. So what we're learning is all these different colors of grain, especially the corn, will produce unique flavors to your bourbon. So these farmers are not just making yellow corn or red corn, they're making a lot of different species of corn and of the rye and the barley, as Pat was talking about. So it's not just a cut and dried thing, as Leonard, as you well know, since you're teaching the class. That's what's exciting about this is that it's not the image that people had years ago of somebody sitting out in the woods somewhere, like my grandfather on my mom's side up in the mountains of Kentucky. I'm from Breathitt County. So my granddad mined his own coal and his buddies ran moonshine, steals out of the coal mine. Well, that was a very scary proposition up in that area. But they had their culture and their tradition of the way that they made whiskey. And each one made it a little bit different because it created a different taste profile. So that, to me, what you and Pat are involved in right now, that's the new environment. This is not something that's being done back in the woods. This is full-blown operation that has basically caused young folks going to school to realize chemistry and making good hooch have something in common.
So actually, you sort of have gone into like a bunch of the different corn varieties. And one of the questions that's already come in, for people that aren't as familiar, we've been talking about rye and we've been talking about corn and whiskey in general. Would you just run us through quickly the distinction, sort of broad distinctions about what makes a rye bourbon or what makes a wheated bourbon or those sorts of things?
Well, sure. So bourbon, by definition, has to be made from at least 51% corn. But then there's always a secondary grain that adds some flavor. And if it's that secondary grain is wheat, then it would be called a high wheat bourbon. Or if that secondary grain is the rye, then it'd be a high rye bourbon. Now you have to be careful a lot of times and really watch what it's saying on the label, because if it says just a rye whiskey, then it's not a bourbon. If it's a rye whiskey, it's gonna be made with at least 51% rye rather than the corn. So it's a distinction to watch out for.
Excellent. Thanks for.
So,
Go ahead, Freddie.
it's kind of a lot of people get mixed up about the table files. So I just tell folks at a very high level, all you have to remember is rye is robust and wheat is sweet. It's a softer, smoother bourbon. And so it's a nice way of introducing someone to bourbon is you could start with a good wheated bourbon before you give them the punch of the rye.
So that's a great example of why you're in the Bourbon Hall of Fame, Freddie. Those types of interactions that at the end of the day, it's about the way you interpret the story of bourbon for your consumers, right? The people that come to the distillery, and you're clearly excellent at that. How do you? I'm muted and I've been talking for quite a while. Good call, somebody told me. Sorry about that. So Freddie, let's try that again. You just gave us a great example of why you're in the Bourbon Hall of Fame, right? That interaction with customers, that education that you do, that analogy you just made of rye and wheat is just beautiful. And so I'm interested, how do you do that? How do you gauge, you're dealing with people that know nothing about bourbon that come to the distillery to people that are experts at the distillery. How do you gauge that? How do you pitch them the right information that they want?
I can address it, but I'm sure that everyone that's a part of our panel in it can do the same thing. It's sometimes you get a feel, and sometimes people will be very honest with you, and they'll say, "I don't know much about bourbon. I am interested in the history. I'm not really sure about differences in taste profiles." And those are folks that are just very upfront. They're there to learn. And you also have the folks that are collectors. And you have the folks that are really into bourbon. I mean, really into bourbon. And so what you have to do is when those folks walk in and you've got a group, remember, it's your first encounter with them. And so what some people forget is that my objective, if I'm talking to someone about bourbon, my objective is I want everyone to have fun. I want everyone to be able to walk away with something that makes them feel like their time spent with me, whether it's at Jeptha Creed or Wilderness Trail or any of the other distilleries. The deal is I want them to walk away feeling like I made them feel like their time with me was special. And if I do that, I've created an emotional connection with that person, and they'll never forget you or how you made them feel. And when they see that bottle, they think of you, they think of your distillery, and they think of how you make them feel. So part of this culture that we're dealing with, as you're creating them in the classes that you're involved in, part of that emotional connection is a seed that you plant. And that's what's indicative of how you and your distillery is going to be received. So you have to balance that. And if you have we have fun with this because there are some people that come in, and even though you're giving a tour, I'm sure it's happened to you guys at the distillery, and I'm looking at Mary back there. Mary's headed at the bars. Somebody comes in, and before you can even pour them a drink, they can tell you everything about everything you've got on the shelf back there and all that. And so the question is, well, why are you here? Because you take away from the folks that really want to have a good time. So it's not just me. The bourbon industry, I believe, has taken off because we get it. Joyce gets it. Pat gets it. Mary gets it. Leonard gets it. I mean, if you look at all these folks at the different distilleries, they get it. It's like, make me feel part of the family. And the other piece is you'll help each other out. People on the tours will help each other out. and talk about things that's going on with the industry. That to me is the secret. That's the key. Is we were doing a snapshot, and I think we looked at last year, and well, last year is not really a good example, but it still continued on. But the year before, over 1 million people had visited these sites. It's over 1 million people, and if you think about those folks, talk to other folks, and then you begin to understand why there's so much excitement in the industry right now. So that's just my view. And you know, Pat, Mary, Joyce, y'all can say that's just how I see it. But feel free to throw something else in there with it.
Well, Freddie, you just made me think about how the bourbon industry has been so warm and welcoming to us, to Jeptha Creed, and us personally. And I think that that's kind of part of the culture that's in Kentucky, and what the culture plus of this event is about, and is represented there in that, you're right, the bourbon industry and all the distilleries, you know, work really closely together and share a lot of information and, you know, help each other out. And, you know, there's a term that I heard when we first started working in the industry, and it's frenemies, and how all the distilleries are friendly and everybody gets along. And it's not till you get to the retail shelf that things become kind of harsh and enemy-like. So I know that's part of what I think is awesome about bourbon, and it's particularly awesome about Kentucky, how, you know, we can be so, you know, nice and hospitable to each other, even though we're competitors.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. You know, I think most bourbon drinkers don't just have one bourbon that they drink. You know, I mean, I definitely drink my fair share of Wilderness Trail, but I've also got several bottles of Buffalo Trace. I got Jeptha Creed. You know, if you're a bourbon drinker, you're going to want to enjoy a lot of different things. And so it is a very communal industry, and you know, it's not really cutthroat like a lot of other industries are. Everybody's really good friends, and everybody gets along really well with each other and helps each other out when they need it.
There's a fun thing. You can be at your distillery and look around, and you'll see folks from other distilleries coming by taking a tour at your distillery, and we like to do that, and it's to make sure that we're kind of like all on the same page. And as Joyce had indicated, you're going to be hard pressed in this industry, especially here in Kentucky, to visit a distillery, to visit a site and have them talk disparagingly about another distillery. There's just nothing to be gained by that. We're all here together, and your bourbon speaks for itself. And sometimes you look for unique flavors and taste profiles, because that puts you on a different page. And that's what it's about. It's the uniqueness of what you can do. But you can still sit down at a bar, and you can have a pour of 2 or 3 different things, and you can have fun with your friends. And just like Pat was talking about, it's just cool comparing different whiskeys and bourbons. And there's nothing threatening about it, because in the end, you're going to buy the one you like.
So sort of shifting gears a little bit, several of you have scientific training and engineering training in your backgrounds. And I'm going to pitch this at Pat first, because in Pat's case, it was the science that sprung forth the distillery. Firm Solutions was the business that was there first. So how does that scientific background approach the way you either make bourbon or interpret bourbon for visitors?
Well, I mean, if you look at all the different facets of the process of making bourbon, you know, grain quality and selection, how that grain is treated in terms of milling and making a flour out of it, temperatures of the mashing process, the length of time that you're going to mash, you know, in terms of converting starch into fermentable sugars. You get into the fermentation process, you got all the questions around the yeast and the flavor, yield, you know, how much alcohol are we making per bushel of grain? Is there bacterial contamination in there? Is there wild yeast in there? Then you get into distillation, and then the whole thing of sweet mash versus sour mash. I mean, so many facets of this process that can benefit from understanding, and even getting down to energy consumption. So there's just so many different facets of the process that lend well to, you know, being scientific about it, that it really has been beneficial from, I mean, speaking personally, definitely.
I would totally agree with Pat. I think, you know, my chemical engineering background allows me to be able to get into the details and understand the ins and outs of a lot of those process pieces that he just mentioned. I think it's also been pretty awesome for us in initially anyway, that I could save myself a lot of money on my engineering at the beginning. So I could size my own chillers, you know, I understood about the chillers and the utilities and all of those pieces. I had all that background. I could size the still and the processes with the cooker and the fermentation tanks, size all that myself. And it's just really, really handy to be able to understand, you know, what's going on in those processes. Because one of the things, you know, especially as a craft distillery, well, all of them have to do this. You want to be able to understand those pieces so you can control them and measure them and keep them consistent so that your product comes out as consistently as you can, at least going into the barrel. You know, once it's in the barrel, it kind of becomes a different story. But if you've got the same repeatable mash bill going in that barrel, it helps you to understand what you have and what's going into your bottle.
Let me give you a crazy example of something that happened. And I'm getting a little indication here of looks like we might be clipping a little bit. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so we, prior to COVID, we do a lot of special tours, and one of them that we get involved in is with the FFA, Future Farmers of America. And on this particular day, these buses are rolling in, and we're taking the kids out on these tours. So my background is engineering, chemistry, and science. And what happened to me was this. So I'm doing this tour, and there's this kid on the tour who looks like, I mean, he's just walking around, he's looking at stuff, and we go into regauge, which is where we marry the barrels together. He's leaning up against the post, and we're talking about that piece of the process. And basically, he's like a loner. And I looked at this kid, and I asked him, I said, hey, man, I said, are you a doodler? And before he could even respond, his teacher said, all the time, he's always doodling. So I looked at this kid and I said, let me ask you a question. I said, why do you doodle? And he said, because I'm bored. I said, oh, really? And I said, well, I used to be a doodler also. And I said, the reason that I'm asking that question is, I said, why? And he said, well, I don't want to be disruptive to the class. He says, when I got it, I got it. But in school, you have to learn, you have to do it and over and over. He says, and so I doodle so that I don't disrupt the class. And I said, well, look around in this room. And this is, Leonard, here's where I'm taking you with this. I said, look around in this room. I said, look at the whiskey that's being dumped in the barrel, of the barrel. I said, look at the mechanical designs of these tracks and all this equipment that is dumping that whiskey automatically. And I said, and it's going into those tanks to be processed. I said, all those mechanical things were done by a doodler. I said, because created years ago before schools were even the way to go. And the kid kind of looked at me and the teacher looked at me and I said, my point is simply this. I said, they were creators. And I said, all your teacher is doing for you is, I said, your teacher is really your friend. I said, their job is to plant that seed I was referring to earlier. Their job is to plant a seed, to give you a theory. And your job is to take that theory and apply it to the world that we live in today. So when people come to a distillery, like Pat was talking about what he'd gone through, and Joyce, the background that you have with chemistry, if you think about it, all of those pieces, everything from agriculture to forestry to fermentation to yeast strains to structural engineering to designs to marketing to business to shelf presentation, your glassware of your bottles and things like that, your labels, those are all components of this industry, but they all have a place in the industry. And so what I try to get people to do is pick out things that you like, and whether it's the bourbon industry or something else, you can apply those things that you're picking up from your instructor or your teacher. It's like, think about what you can do with them. So what the kid did was the kid hooked up with a teacher on the bus back. I got one of the nicest letters about it. And she said, you'll never believe what me, and I won't mention his name, what we came up with was. She said, what I told him was this: when I start to roll out something and you get it, just tell me that you got it. And she says, I won't bug you anymore. And he started smiling. She said he got this big smile on his face. And she says, but I'm going to ask you to do something for me. And she said, I'm going to ask you to help me help the kids that don't get it on the first time. And believe it or not, what actually happened was that kid became, rather than being a loner, he became the most sought after kid in his class, and he became student of the year. And all he did was help others see it the way that he saw it. So sometimes it's not about how you make the product, okay? It's the way you approach making the product that really gets people excited. So that's, I mean, I don't want to go on and on, but I'm just so happy to be a part of this because we're planting seeds. And if you don't walk away with anything else from what I said, we plant seeds with friends and family every day. And that's the cool part of the bourbon industry is you can take any facet of the industry, and I guarantee you it applies to the world that we live in today.
Freddie, I'll piggyback off of that. My story isn't quite as touching as that, but we had a student come in and and the students wrote a bunch of thank you notes, and the one guy was like, thank you. Now I know what my dad's got going on in the garage.
So sort of on the, we started all of that thinking about science. And one of the questions that's come in on the chat is sort of thinking about what we typically think about as the opposite end of the spectrum. I think, Freddie, you did a nice job talking about and bringing up how scientists are often thought of as fairly rigid, but we're actually kind of creative people. And so somebody asked how bourbon has contributed to art, for example, through architecture, visitor center, or bottle and label design, or other ways that we see the artist in the culture of bourbon.
Well, I think that's a Pat question.
Well, you know, there obviously there's a lot of craft that goes into this. You know, I mean, we talked about a lot of the different aspects of it. Certainly, and you know, being a new distillery, I can say from experience, you know, when you got 4 years to wait before you're going to put anything out, you got plenty of time to kind of focus on what the bottle's going to look like and what the label's going to look like. Certainly, you know, the artwork, and even nowadays you look at these groups that are doing barrel picks and they're expressing themselves with the different types of stickers they're putting on there. I mean, I've seen some of these barrel picks going for crazy secondary prices because of the cool sticker that goes on the side of the bottle. So it is really kind of a revolution of artistic creativity going on right now, not just with the making of it, but the way that people enjoy it.
And Mary, how about you?
Thank you, Freddie. I was going to say, I so much respect the chemistry background, and I wish I had it. But speaking of, you know, the flip side of the bourbon industry, the marketing, the visual bottle, it reminded me. I did have a personal experience with Tom Bullitt of Bullitt Bourbon, and his before this bar was a bar, this room was a bar, this room was a photo studio, and so my brother-in-law worked for Diageo. He got me the photo shoot with Tom Bullitt at Pepe Van Winkle's distillery. So, I mean, it was this cold February day. We were freezing, and of course, you can't take electricity in a rick house. So it's very controlled. And at the end of the day, man, were we ever ready for a bourbon? And actually, there was a Center College intern with me, and Tom was so cold. He was in his car most of the time in between the photo shoot. But so we're finally ready for our sip in this lovely room, and Tom started telling us about all that went into the Bullet Bourbon bottle. There were like a lot of focus groups on. If you notice, it kind of fits your hand. It was the tagline for that bourbon is a pioneer bourbon. The label is intentionally crooked, and so that doesn't all just happen, because someone woke up and did it. He was just telling us about how many focus groups it took, and how it was almost, I think it was a 2-year process to develop that bottle and that label. And to me, like, what fun is that? That's a great job. I mean, and it's one that is that would be more artistic and more kind of shows a different field other than science. But man, do I respect that your science knowledge.
Our label's crooked too. It's just because we can't get to go on straight.
So Mary Robin, sort of continuing that thread of art, a different form of art is designing recipes. And so somebody was asking, we've talked a lot about drinking bourbon, but how does bourbon impact the food recipes that you design?
Well, I love thinking about food, like the book, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. I like to think about about food and even lunch and what's in your refrigerator and how you're gonna put it together in terms of those things. And so when I look at bourbon, I think, there's something that can give depth and give sweetness, and sometimes a little punch that perhaps your sauce is missing. And I was, in trying to be useful to the audience, I also thought, if you think about the many French sauces that get a hit of cognac at the end, I was telling them earlier in the week, lessen your sugar and give it a hit of bourbon and see how that changes the flavor. But if you think of like the brown sugar, the molasses, the sorghum, the vanilla flavor that's in bourbon, and then if you think about what comes to mind too is, like, for example, I don't know when Maker's 46 came out, but that was explained to retailers as what we did. We took the flavors that focus groups or that people say they love about bourbon, like vanilla, and it was vanilla, but just like what the wood imparts. And so let's magnify that as much as we can. And so that's the idea of putting staves down in the barrel, and that's all the playing with those elements that are adding these certain flavors to their new Maker's 46 product. So yeah, I would say add some bourbon to your chocolate chip cookies with the vanilla, and just if I think when you're missing a little depth and you're in kind of like the darker caramelized brown sugar, molasses, sorghum type of flavors. So don't do this with the lemon and white wine sauce. Like, don't put the bourbon in there. So you have to kind of think, if you're on the other heavier end of the spectrum, with when you utilize like a brown spirit, then kind of, I would say experiment. You know, a tablespoon of bourbon, you'll taste it, but it'll also cook out. The alcohol goes out pretty fast. So, you know, put it in your chocolate sauce. And I'm just trying to be helpful and give you some useful tips. It's fun to play with for sure. I would even say it's not as salty like Worcestershire, but you could sub it out for that and see what happens too.
Joyce?
Bourbon chocolate chip cookies sound fabulous.
Yeah, I'm sort of wishing I got that recipe ahead of time and here with me tonight. So thinking a little bit wider, one of the questions that's come in is, what's the market like globally, and are there cultural or political obstacles in that expansion into the global markets?
Well, there's different regulations involved, you know, I mean, everybody's, you know, kind of a hot button topic right now are the tariffs between the EU and the United States. So there's that kind of tension. You know, there's the whole competition between American whiskeys and bourbon and Scotch and Irish whiskeys. Those kind of things.
You know, it's kind of interesting, Lenny, when you ask that, because you have to think about whiskey. Actually, as we know, whiskey, the origin was Scotch and Irish whiskey. And so that came to North America. So the original settlers coming in here, Scottish, Irish, and Welsh, they were making rye and barley whiskeys. So if you look at what you had asked, the deal is bourbon is just now going into parts of the world that the only whiskey they've ever known is either a local whiskey or Scotch whiskey. So to me, the bourbon industry is just getting started as an international product. I mean, we're just now getting a footstep into some of these places that if you talk about a whiskey, they're going to give you a Scottish whiskey name, not a bourbon name.
And so
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Joyce.
I was going to say, we just took our first step into the international markets and just got into the United Kingdom. And the market over there seems to be going for us very well so far. Seems to be working out really well.
And so a little closer to home, somebody wants to know when your bourbons are going to be available in New Jersey, but sort of we'll let Joyce and Pat answer that, but also what sort of obstacles are there into expanding into other states?
Well, we're in New Jersey currently. That's one of the most recent states we've gotten into. So I'll tell you what, right now, being in the bourbon industry with all of the benefits of social media, I'm probably a member of 75 or 80 different bourbon groups and whiskey groups from all over the place. And I mean, you know, while we're sleeping, they're all still talking about our whiskeys. And anybody here on the panel is whiskey. So we've got a nation of bourbon fanatics who are doing a great job of supporting us. And that's one. It's kind of like being in music when MTV first came out. You know, you got the advantage of getting a video on there. And I mean, this is just, it's unprecedented, the amount of press that's going around right now just in these bourbon groups. And so that's kind of one of the first steps, at least for us, of getting people familiar. I mean, in most cases for us, we're not really having to spend a lot of money or a lot of energy getting into a state outside of just making sure we've got the inventory to support it. The people are already there talking about it, and they have been for a while. So we're currently in like 32 different states, and there's 3 or 4 really good bourbon states that are just dying because they're not one of the ones. And so it's really a special time for being in this industry, and especially for new distilleries.
Yeah, I would agree. some of the answer to the question is around, each state, the rules and regulations for getting distribution in each state is like trying to get into 50 different countries. They're all different, wildly different sometimes. One of the good things that Kentucky is doing, and Kentucky is actually a leader in the country right now, is setting up legislation that allows direct to consumer shipping and ordering online like all the other products in the world. But bourbon and the distilled spirits have been under a lot of prohibition laws and rules. And we're just now, literally just now, getting out from underneath them. Kentucky has recently passed the House Bill 415, and that allows us to have direct to consumer shipping. But one of the problems with it is that you have to have reciprocal states, and that those states allow the bourbon and spirits to go in. And right now there's only like 7 of them. So that piece and getting, my product into New Jersey, that's probably going to be our most direct route right now. And that is still probably a couple of years away. One thing that needs to happen is New Jersey needs to say, hey, it's okay.
There's a tough part to this. And the tough part is that Pat had touched on it earlier. You make a good product, but you make it and you're going to wait 4 to 8, 10 years for it to get out there. And I mean, if you're financially responsible, you're not going to make it thinking that you're going to set the world on fire. So you're going to be a little bit cautious about how much you make. Well, you make it, people like it, and then the next thing you're faced with is how much of it can I send out? And, I've got all these states that I'd love to send it to, but I only have so much. So then you got the next dilemma, Joyce, and that is how much do I send to which states? Which ones am I going to go for? And no matter which ones you send it to, the others are going to say, well, you didn't send me enough. So it's a balance. And our president, Mark Brown, said, it's really, this whole industry is a crapshoot because we're making a whole bunch. I was listening to Pat talk about how much they're cranking out right now, but that's based on what we think the environment's going to be like 8, 10 years from now. So what a lot of people don't realize, the beauty of Kentucky is once you put that spirit into that barrel and put it in your aging facility, the tax clock starts ticking. So you're paying a property tax, an ad valorem tax on that barrel the whole time it sits there. And so if you want to make a really good product, it's going to have to sit there for a while. And you're going to have to come up with a revenue stream to help you offset that so that whiskey comes out as something that you're really going to be proud of. Because we all know if you release it too soon and it's not aged properly, people will remember that bad batch of whiskey. And then you're up against a creek. So the deal is that a lot of people are complaining because there's not enough of the good stuff out there. But the reality is you have to be responsible with, what am I going to do with the product that I make? And then how much more of it am I going to make? And how long can I leave it sit? And so that's a decision that each distillery has to make. And if you're a newbie, like I was listening to Pat talking about what he's up against, that's what you're faced with. And Joyce, you as well, is how much can I make? How much can I hold on to? All right. And what is the weather looking like? What are all the government regulations that I'm faced with? Because all those will be factors in how much whiskey I'm going to make. It's an amazing process. So that's why I said, Lenny, that it's not just about making stuff. The chemistry lab is great, but you've got all these other little tentacles hanging off of it, and they all will affect your product. Just me.
So this has been wonderful, and I could feel like I could sit around and talk to you all night, and we appreciate that. I wanted to ask really quickly, because we got a question from a student about if you wanted to get started in the bourbon industry, how do you get started? And so if each of you could just one quick sentence, tips for students looking to get into the industry.
Yeah, I mean, as you're well aware, we've had a robust history with internship program with Center College as well as University of Kentucky and other schools. And I mean, that's a great way to get your foot in, get a little bit of experience. I mean, there's so many different facets of it. I mean, a lot of internships, you're cleaning out the garbage can. Not ours though. We're putting students in the middle of something that's important, and we make sure to do a good job and work hard, make sure that they leave with just exactly the answer to that question. What's going to be my next step? If I want to stay in this industry, how can I use this experience as a building block, take it to the next step? So internships probably would be, in my opinion, one of the easiest and most accessible ways to get experience in this industry from a student's perspective.
I would agree. Internships are great. There are a limited number of the internships, so I would also encourage them to consider, any opening or any job and applying for them. And even if it's not in their exact field of study at school, that maybe they want to go on and pursue that open position to get into the industry and then find their way along.
Just a thought for me, Joyce, along with you and Pat were talking about is there are other avenues. I mean, because if you think about, just like for us in our chemistry lab, one of the folks in there, I call him our fermentation guru, but Kevin started with yeast and with different things like that. So there are other companies. There are other pieces that you can actually create a background, a portfolio that lends itself nicely to this industry, because it's always nice to have subject matter knowledge and a good background in the other pieces and how they fit in with your industry.
Well, with that, speaking of sort of getting starts in different places, a little known fact maybe is that Firm Solutions and Wilderness Trail, Pat and Shane got it started in a garage band that's performed. And so music has inspired bourbon. But the exciting part of the next part of our program is that bourbon can also inspire the creation of music. And so tonight's encore group is the group Invoke. And their love of bourbon is so strong that their Patreon giving levels are named after favorite bourbons. And they've got a great set for us, including at least one song that's inspired by Freddie's stomping grounds at Buffalo Trace. And so we're going to turn the program over to them. Thank you all to the panelists. And thank you, Joanna, for signing tonight and translating. And we appreciate that. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Invoke.
All righty. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Mannion, and we are Invoke. This is Carl to my left, and Zach to my right, and shuffling outside very soon will be Nick. And we're coming to you live from Austin, Texas. And it's so much fun to be part of this event. As was mentioned, bourbon is a big part of our lives. We are enjoying some at this very moment. And as it happens, I have brought 2 bottles from my own collection from 2 of the 3 wonderful distilleries represented this evening. In my glass is a wonderful store pick of Wilderness Trail from a local Austin store by the name of ABC Liquors. It's a delicious rye whiskey, and we in Invoke really love not only making music, but enjoying aged spirits. And so we're here to play a couple of tunes inspired by that. And first off, we're going to pay homage to what is in my glass and in some of our others with a tune by one of the bands that was the inspiration for the 4 of us when we got together almost 8 years ago now. Everything they do is awesome, and it's kind of a fusion of bluegrass with classical virtuosity. And we kind of view ourselves kind of almost as the opposite. We came from the classical world, and now we're folksy and bluegrassy. This is Rye Whiskey by the Punch Brothers.
Makes the band sound better, makes your baby cuter, makes yourself taste sweeter. Oh boy, rye whiskey makes your heart beat louder, makes your voice seem softer, makes the back room hotter. But rye thoughts aren't good thoughts, boys. Have I ever told you about the time isn't good sleep, boys. Have I ever told you about the time I took it and took her for granted? How I took it and took her for granted. So let's take some and take them all for granted.
Thank you all very much. So our next whiskey-inspired, bourbon-inspired selection for the evening is one of our own original compositions. It's actually one of the first tunes we wrote as a group. And at the time, we were drinking a whole lot of Buffalo Trace, and we still do. As a matter of fact, I got some right down here. And as you do when you drink a lot, you write songs and you dedicate them to drinking. So this song is called The Trace, dedicated to Buffalo Trace. And we've continued to play it for many, many years. It's about 6-7 years old now, right? The Trace. Yeah. But still one of our favorite spirits and one of our favorite songs. So I got to switch banjos, so bear with us for a second for The Trace.
Yeah, when we play this one for kid shows, we don't tell them it's about bourbon. We just tell them it's about the great outdoors.
Which is also true.
Also true. Actually, I think it was the buffalo on the label.
Yeah. So there's the regality of the buffalo in nature, but also the regality of the spirit in the glass.
Absolutely. Can we? I'm gonna grab that quote.
Frame that, yeah, Steve.
That's good.
Steve's been great in the chat, putting in all the awesome little gems from the conversation tonight. So thank you, Steve. mosquito on my arm that whole solo.
Slap the mosquito. All right. That's a nice one to listen evaporate into the, outdoor air, as humid as it might be. All right, so we got to listen to a bit of the talk, which was super cool. I mean, that was what a meeting of the minds. I mean, that was really awesome to hear. And I heard a lot of people talking about the weird fact that prohibition law still very much affects us today in this day and age. Crazy to me. In various forms, obviously not in its initial intended form. But this song was one that I actually wrote and worked on with the guys that is about prohibition, but from a historical standpoint, right around when it first occurred. And it explores the idea of what it would have been like to be a distiller or a brewer or a purveyor of spirits when that legislation hit, and to see your whole livelihood just like taken away and have to come up with a way to care for your family or yourself during those times. Yeah, so there's some references in here. I guess we could talk a little more about it, because normally I don't have this much time to talk about this one. There's some references in here to how they used to make like super shady booze on the side. Different like inns or restaurants would make this like very strange like concoction and then throw it in like a bottle and call it clear liquor and then say it's like gin from South Africa or something like that. This was like a super common thing. So also like everywhere was brewing their own beer. So it was kind of a really neat spurring point for entrepreneurship, one might say, regardless of the societal ramifications. At the same time, from a perspective of race and equality, the Prohibition really was one of the first times you saw people of different races in America drinking together, because booze was illegal for you no matter what the color of your skin was or what gender you were, because it was also one of the first time that men and women were drinking in acceptable circumstances together in various forms. So it's kind of this really crazy moment of America coming together, but at the same time being oppressed by itself for, in my opinion, no good reason. Not that oppression ever has one. Yeah, this is called Prohibition Song. There's a little bit at the end about a green door. That's because legend has it that a lot of these speakeasies where booze would be sold had a green door so you knew where you were going. Up the door frame here, the manager, she tells us to all clear. Sorry officer, I can't allow you in, but there's a crate of pretty South American gin just around the corner, hiding in the bin. Oh, the senators are calling for some cheer, some whiskey, blended wine, and homemade beer. They say don't be concerned, we'll work around. The laws we pass will push the whole thing down. The guards will let you in without a sound. For every fella working at their still, there's a dozen men like them who'll pay the bill. They tell us that we can't afford our homes, that our wives and kids will soon be skin and bones, and we'll end up homeless, drunk, and all alone. Oh, well, I don't believe we'll all end up in hell. A little fear of fire will serve me well. They tell us that we cannot save our souls, as if what we drink sinks deeper than our bones. And if there's only one thing this has ever let's make one thing clear. People of all sorts are welcome here. Now everybody raise a glass and pour. Pour one out for hers and his and theirs and yours. Let's drink tonight behind the screen door.
Thank you all so much for coming out and for staying with us during the encore.
Or staying in, I guess.
Yeah, staying in for this amazing encore of Connect Plus Bourbon. One thing that I think I enjoy most about drinking bourbon with these guys is that it's all about, we're friends at the start and then the band members afterwards, which is, for me, what it's all about. And that's what drinking bourbon together is all about too. So we hope we get to join you all for real coming up soon at the Norton Center. And thank you, Steve, and everybody for putting this on and inviting us to be on it. Hope you guys have a great night.
Cheers, everyone.